All right, Chapter 6, Serving Your Community. Unit 1, Lesson 1, Introduction to Responding to Your Community. Good communication, critical thinking, and sound judgment are crucial for determining when you should use force and when you should try other methods to resolve conflict. A vulnerable adult is a person 18 or older whose ability to perform the everyday activities of daily living or to provide for their own care or protection is impaired. Often this is due to a mental, emotional, sensory, long-term physical, or developmental disability or dysfunction, brain damage, or the infirmities of aging. Techniques to use when responding to vulnerable adults: minimize distractions and disperse any crowds, respect personal space and avoid physical contact, remember to relax and breathe and use calming body language, allow self-stimulating behaviors for individuals with autism to continue. Once the person has calmed, assist them as needed. Then interacting with your community here, speak clearly and in a respectful tone of voice, short, simple phrases, model the behavior that you want to see, maintain a calm and reassuring tone, and use encouragement throughout your encounter. To maintain peace and help prevent a situation from escalating, employ these techniques. Practice calming, which is to diffuse the intensity of the situation, treat people with courtesy, and speak politely to create a comfortable atmosphere for conversation. Practice active listening. Then assess the situation, be aware of behavior statements and the possible role of substances, and consider the environment. Be aware of the environment's effect and the current circumstances, including the presence of injuries or signs of substance abuse. An elderly person. According to Chapter 825 Florida statutes, it is a person 60 years of age or older who is suffering from the infirmities of aging as manifested by advanced age or organic brain damage or other physical, mental, or emotional dysfunction, to the extent that the ability of the person to provide adequately for the person's own care or protection is impaired. Common characteristics of an elderly person may include limited mobility, vision or hearing, lack of strength, bone deterioration, or memory loss. You may encounter an elderly person who has wandered away from their home or living facility due to memory loss or declining health. In this situation, you may consider initiating a silver alert to aid in their rescue or recovery. You will learn about initiating a silver alert in Chapter 7. Two common causes of memory loss in an elderly person include dementia and Alzheimer's disease. Dementia is an organic, progressive mental disorder characterized by the loss of memory and impairment of judgment and abstract thinking and changes in personality. Alzheimer's disease is a progressive brain disorder that gradually destroys a person's memory and ability to learn, reason, make judgments, communicate, and carry out daily activities. As Alzheimer's progresses, a person may experience changes in personality and behavior such as anxiety, suspicion, or agitation, as well as delusions and hallucinations. So again, dementia is organic, progressive mental disorder, and Alzheimer's disease is a progressive brain disorder. So the difference between the two, dementia is organic and mental, where Alzheimer's is just a progressive brain disorder. So with Alzheimer's, think of brain. When dementia, think of organic mental disorder. Resources for people who are elderly. The Department of Elder Affairs provides direct services to the elderly through its division of statewide community-based services. Then you have the Florida Elder Helpline at 1-800-96-ELDER. Then you have the 211 Helpline. This is another resource available to all persons, including the elderly, looking for resources or assistance in a variety of areas, such as crisis counseling and disaster, housing, and food assistance. Then we move on to juveniles here. Make sure you know that the brain is not fully developed until the age of 25. And juveniles who start offending when they are younger than 13 are more likely to become serious and violent offenders. So younger than 13, if they're offending and committing crimes, they're more likely to become serious and violent offenders. Interacting with juveniles. A juvenile younger than 7 years of age may not be arrested or charged unless the violation is a forcible felony or a third-degree felony of burglary or trespassing with burglary tools. So again, under 7 years of age, they cannot be arrested. Runaway children, you have no arrest authority for a child who is run away or an absentee from school. And know that protective custody is not a criminal arrest. And move on to serving and interacting with veterans. Some veterans may have pronounced stressors caused by musculoskeletal injuries, neurological injuries, or psychological disorders. A traumatic brain injury, TBI, is a structural injury sustained by the brain, frequently resulting from combat. Some common signs and symptoms of TBI are loss of balance, slurred speech, disorientation, and irritability. There are two things when being involved with a veteran. One, gain their trust, and two, do not corner the person. Cornering veterans, especially those who might have a TBI or PTSD, is one of the biggest mistakes you can make. So again, with veterans, do not corner them. That is one of the biggest mistakes. Then you have coping behaviors exhibited by veterans, abusing substances, avoiding others or avoiding reminders of the trauma, always staying on guard, feeling anger and resorting to violence, engaging in dangerous behavior, and working too much. Then you have Lesson 5, serving people who are homeless. Homelessness. Homeless means a person does not have a fixed, regular, and adequate nighttime residence. Unsheltered refers to people who live in places not meant for human habitation, such as the streets, cars, wooded areas, or abandoned buildings. Others are quote-unquote sheltered, but are still homeless because they're staying in homeless shelters or transitional housing until they find stable, permanent housing of their own. So again, unsheltered means they live in places not meant for human habitation, and sheltered means they're still homeless, but they're staying in homeless shelters or transitional housing. Many people who are homeless have committed what are considered imprisonable offenses, such as thefts, burglary, or other crimes of opportunity. Basically meaning any crimes that you would normally go to prison for. Being homeless is not a crime. It is almost never a choice. Americans with Disabilities Act, Lesson 6. The Americans with Disabilities Act, ADA, is a federal civil rights law that prohibits discrimination against people with disabilities in all areas of public life, such as jobs, schools, and transportation. Again, that's ADA, Americans with Disability. According to the ADA, a person with a disability is someone who has a physical or mental impairment that substantially limits a major life activity, has a record of impairment, or is regarded as having an impairment. A substantial limitation is a restriction of the way, condition, or amount of time in which a person can perform major life activities compared to non-impaired people. So again, substantial limitation. This is a restriction in the way where they can't perform their normal life activities like normal people can. The most common disabilities that you will encounter are psychiatric or mental disabilities, neurological impairments, vision, hearing, and speech impairments, and extremity impairments. The ADA does not prevent you from enforcing laws, but it does affect how you interact with people who have disabilities. Okay, now protecting the rights of people with disabilities. Chapter 825 of the Florida Statutes defines a disabled adult as a person 18 years of age or older who suffers from a condition of physical or mental incapacitation due to developmental disability, organic brain damage, or mental illness, or who has one or more physical or mental limitations that restricts the person's ability to perform the normal activities of daily living. That is a disabled adult. If you arrest a person with a disability, inform correctional personnel of this disability. Under the ADA, a service animal is defined as a dog that has been individually trained to do work or perform tasks for a person with a disability. So I know some people had confusion with this on the test. Remember that ADA with a service animal is a dog. It's not a small horse. It's not any animal. It's not certified animals. It is a dog that has been individually trained to perform tasks. No certification is required under the law. If it is apparent that the animal is a service animal, you may not question the animal's service. And if it's not apparent, you can only ask 2 questions. 1, is the dog a service animal required because of this disability? And 2, what work or task has the dog been trained to perform? Then you have mobility impairment. The ADA defines physical or mobility impairment as a functional limitation that affects one or more of a person's limbs. So again, mobility impairment, one or more limbs. Vision impairment. The ADA defines vision impairment as a loss or partial loss of sight that cannot be corrected by usual means such as glasses. Blindness is a functional loss of vision. Partial sight is a visual impairment in which, after correction, objects still look dim or out of focus. So remember, blindness is loss of vision. Partial sight is objects look dim or out of focus even after correction. Then we have a hearing impairment. This is any degree of hearing loss. And you have 2 classifications of hearing loss are hard of hearing and deafness. So remember, hearing impairment is any degree of hearing loss. And then you have deafness and hard of hearing. Some people with hearing impairments may have poor balance or slurred speech and may appear to be intoxicated. A certified sign language interpreter is a person who can both receive and express information and interpret it effectively, accurately, and impartially. Make sure when talking with people like these, you provide their rights in a manner understood by them. If a person who has a hearing impairment requests a sign language interpreter during a Miranda situation, you may not continue to question them until the interpreter appears. A person with a hearing impairment has the right to choose what kind of communication help they need according to the ADA. If the situation may be confrontational, do not rely on family members, friends, or children to provide sign language interpretation because you may receive biased information. A speech impairment is a physiological condition that causes a person to have difficulty in producing sound or understandable language. Lesson 8, serving people with developmental disabilities. The Florida statutes define a developmental disability as a disorder or syndrome that is attributed to cerebral palsy, autism, spina bifida, spina bifida, Down syndrome, McDermott syndrome, Prader-Willi syndrome, or an intellectual disability. It is a disability that manifests before the age of 18, constitutes a substantial handicap, and continues indefinitely. Be aware of community resources that can assist, including mental health facilities, the Department of Children and Families, or crisis centers. Intellectual disabilities. Intellectual disabilities are types of developmental disabilities that are lifelong conditions characterized by slow intellectual development. So to recap here, developmental disabilities are basically all disorders or syndromes with cerebral palsy, autism, Down syndrome, or any type of intellectual disability, and a disability that manifests before the age of 18. Where intellectual disability is a type of developmental disability that are lifelong by slow intellectual development. So if you see anything about slow intellectual development or slow development, that's intellectual disability. But if you see anything about any types of Down syndrome, autism, or other types of disabilities, that's most likely developmental disabilities. Intellectual disabilities cannot be cured, but using appropriate modifications and accommodations can enhance the person's capabilities and independence. The majority of people with an intellectual disability function at a mild level of disability, which may not be easily identifiable. People functioning at this level can learn academic and provocational skills with special training and can work within their community. People with a mild intellectual disability might not understand long-range consequences or be able to make appropriate choices, but they do sometimes realize when they have done something wrong. So that is, again, that's mild. They can learn academic and provocational skills, and they can work within their community, and they don't understand long-range consequences, but they realize they did something wrong. People with a moderate intellectual disability may recognize their own needs and wants, but not immediately identify the needs and wants of others. People with a moderate intellectual disability can achieve primary academic education and may be able to perform semi-skilled work under direct supervision. So again, mild is they can learn academic and provocational skills and they can work within the community, where moderate, they can do semi-skilled work, but they have to be under direct supervision. People with a severe intellectual disability have very slow motor development and communication skills and frequently are under close and constant supervision. So if you see anything about constant supervision, that is severe, and they're not capable of living independently. But people with a profound intellectual disability require constant care and supervision, and generally you not come in contact with them, but will deal directly with the caregiver. I see how this could be confusing because with severe, they say close and constant supervision, where profound says constant care and supervision. So I guess if you see close and constant, such as a group setting, then that would be severe. But if you see constant care and supervision and you see the caregiver and they're never in direct sight, that would be profound. People with intellectual disabilities may not be able to distinguish between abstract and concrete thought and might confess to crimes they did not commit. If there is a need for services, refer a person with intellectual disabilities to the Development of Children and Families. That's the DCF. The ARC, which is a nationwide organization that provides resources for people with intellectual and developmental disabilities, or another local intake facility. So remember, local intake facility is the name for any of these other types of resources. Local intake facility. Serving people with autism. The autism spectrum disorder, ASD, is a type of developmental disorder that is diagnosed in early childhood and continues throughout adulthood. People with autism may engage in coping skills known as self-stimulating behaviors. Engaging in these behaviors may allow an overstimulated person to calm down in a stressful environment, or may provide an understimulated person with sensory stimulation. Examples include body rocking, hand flapping, or finger flicking. Some people with autism may also engage in self-injurious behaviors such as hand biting, self-rubbing, or head banging. Again, self-stimulating behaviors, they could help overstimulated calm down or understimulated be stimulated. Then we move on to serving people with mental illnesses. As defined by the Florida statutes, mental illness is the impairment of the mental or emotional process that exercise the conscious control of one's actions. So mental illness, impairment of mental or emotional. Mental, emotional is mental. Developmental disabilities are different from mental illness. Developmental disabilities deal with below average intellectual functioning and the ability to learn and process information, whereas mental illness refers to disturbances in how people process their thoughts, emotions, and behaviors. Developmental disabilities occur before a person reaches adulthood, while mental illness can occur at any time in a person's life. So let's recap. Mental illness can occur at any point. You could be 7 years old and you get a mental illness. You could be 10 and get a mental illness. Developmental disabilities occur before the age of 18, And with mental illness, you can still be a very smart person and have a mental illness. Where if you have a developmental disability, you have problems learning and processing information, you have below average intellect. So again, if you have a mental illness, that does not mean you're dumb. You could be very smart with a mental illness. So treat them like a normal person. They just have problems. Dealing with their thoughts, emotions, and behaviors. If a person stops taking their medication, they may be at risk for suicide or crisis. Then we move on to thought disorders. A thought disorder is a disturbance in a person's ability to create a logical sequence of ideas. A hallucination and a delusion are thought disorders, and an example would be schizophrenia. So with thought disorders, think of schizophrenia, and think of hallucination and delusion. A hallucination is a sensory experience in which a person can see, they can hear, they can taste, and they can smell or feel something that is not there. A delusion is a false belief that is firmly held despite obvious proof of evidence to the contrary. The delusion is this person's reality. So for example, I'm being followed by the CIA, that would be a delusion, where hallucination is they're biting into a piece of metal, but they're like, yo, it tastes like a cheeseburger, right? Because they can taste it, hear it, smell it, things like that. So remember, thought disorder is they can't have a sequence of ideas in their brain, and the schizophrenia. Then we have a mood disorder. Mood disorders are emotional disturbances with long periods of excessive sadness, excessive joyousness, or both. So remember, it's super sad or super happy. Think of bipolar disorder or major depressive disorder. So think of just your mood swinging from way too happy, way too sad, or both of them. That would be bipolar. Then you have an anxiety disorder, such as OCD. An anxiety disorder is different from the occasional anxiety we all experience. Anxiety episodes of the disorder are more frequent and intense, and they last longer, and they impact the person's ability to function normally. They could be from mild to debilitating. A person with an anxiety disorder may experience a panic attack with symptoms of a racing heartbeat, sweating, tension, and the feeling that something terrible is about to happen. Again, that is OCD, an obsessive compulsive disorder, and that is anxiety. So anxiety, think of OCD, and it impacts in their life to the point where they can't act normal. Then we have personality disorders. Personality disorder is a deeply ingrained, non-psychotic, inflexible pattern of relating, perceiving, and behaving. Examples of personality disorders include antisocial personality disorder and narcissistic personality disorder. So what's nice about personality disorders with the examples is the word personality is in the disorder. So if you see a disorder that has the word personality in it, it's probably a personality disorder, antisocial or narcissistic. Then we move on here to crisis situations. Crisis intervention is one of your most important duties as a law enforcement officer. Your goals during a crisis situation are to ensure the safety of all people involved, provide assistance to the person or people in distress, restore or maintain peace, act on any law violations, and document the incident as appropriate. Crisis intervention is a potentially hazard part of your duties as a law enforcement officer. A crisis is a time of intense difficulty, trouble, or danger, especially when the affected person feels unprepared and pressured to take action or make a decision. It is also defined by the person's perception and response to the event. A crisis can add stress to a person's life or to an entire community, and there are significant crises that people may experience at some point in time. Examples are death of a loved one, a serious health issue, financial loss, job loss, separation from family and friends, natural disasters, house fires, and vehicle accidents. Behavioral characteristics of a person in crisis would be unreal calmness, sweating, clenching the teeth, tightening the lips, pointing fingers, pacing, clenching, unclenching fists, heavy rapid breathing, or flushed face. Realize that not every instance requires legal action on your part. Some crises can be resolved through effective communication. Tips for speaking with a person in crisis include summarizing their thoughts and feelings, helping them feel validated, be empathetic, avoid minimizing their problems, don't give advice, avoid placing blame or criticizing, ask how you can help. Make sure you relocate this person to a safe environment, make a referral for services, help with transportation, and they must be removed from the situation for their safety. Then we move on to the Baker Act. The Florida Mental Health Act of 1971, also referred to as the Florida Baker Act or simply the Baker Act, provides people who have a mental illness or who may harm or neglect themselves or others with an emergency service and temporary detention for psychiatric evaluation and voluntary or involuntary short-term inpatient treatment. A voluntary examination is a decision by a person to willingly seek a psychiatric evaluation for symptoms that may be due to mental illness. All personal identifying information, name, date of birth, home, email addresses, phone number, and governmental issued ID of a person who is voluntary or involuntary admitted for mental health treatment must be kept confidential and exempt from disclosure. So you cannot disclose someone with the Baker Act. Criteria for the Baker Act. 1. The person has refused voluntary examination after receiving a thorough explanation and disclosure of the purpose of the examination, or is unable to determine for themselves whether the examination is necessary. And without care or treatment, the person is likely to 1. Cause serious bodily harm to themselves or others, or suffer from neglect or refuse to care for themselves. Such neglect or a refusal poses a real and presumable threat of substantial harm to their well-being, and they're not able to realize that. So again, 2 things. They refuse the voluntary examination after being informed of the help it will provide. And 2, without care or treatment, the person's going to harm themselves or others, or they're going to suffer from neglect. This includes notifying the intended victim of the threat or initiating an RPO. Suicide risk. Suicide threat calls are life-threatening situations for everyone involved. So it's not just the person, it's everyone involved. Once on scene, immediately determine if the person has access to weapons. So again, if they ask, first thing you do when you get on the scene, immediately determine if they have a weapon. Just know that these types of situations can be volatile and you may have to resort to deadly force. Some people may attempt to end their lives by intentionally provoking officers to use deadly force. This is commonly referred to as suicide by cop. The National Suicide Prevention Lifeline is a service available to anyone and may be contacted by any time by calling this random number that I know that's not going to be in the test. Substance abuse. Substance use is the intake of the substance that can lead to substance abuse. Substance abuse is continued misuse of substances which negatively affects the mind and body. Substance dependence is the physical and psychological loss of control due to the disruption of chemicals in the brain. And substance addiction is using a substance consistently in excess despite negative consequences. So we'll go through that again. Substance use is just straight up taking substances. Substance abuse is the continued misuse of substances. Substance dependence is the physical and psychological loss of control and disruption of chemicals in the brain. Where substance addiction is using a substance consistently in excess despite the negative consequences. Substance abuse can also lead to overdose, which is the accidental or intentional use of a dangerously large amount of substance that can lead to death. Keep in mind that you cannot charge, prosecute, or penalize a person for possession of a controlled substance when someone acting in good faith seeks assistance for the person experiencing a drug-related overdose. Make sure you know the illnesses that can mimic substance abuse: diabetic shock, an epileptic episode, high blood pressure, head injury, a stroke, Parkinson's disease, cerebral palsy, or Wernicke syndrome, or degenerative diseases such as Alzheimer's and dementia. Drug treatment. Some jurisdictions offer drug treatment court programs as a choice for people whose criminal charges are the result of substance abuse. Detoxification is often the first step in a drug treatment program. So again, detoxification is the first step. It is a process by allowing the body to rid itself of a drug while managing the symptoms of withdrawal. Withdrawal refers to the physical and mental symptoms that occur after chronic use of a drug is reduced or stopped. And many communities host self-help groups such as Alcoholics Anonymous, Narcotics Anonymous, or Smart Recovery. Now we go to the Marchman Act. The Hall S. Marchman Alcohol and Other Drug Services Act of 1993, commonly known as the Marchman Act, provides substance abusers access to emergency services and temporarily protected custody on either a voluntarily or involuntarily basis. According to Florida law, in the case of an adult, you are authorized to take the person to a detention facility within the jurisdiction. That would be implementing the Marchman Act. In regards to transporting a person in crisis, your agency will have a memorandum of understanding with receiving facilities that reflects a single set of protocols for the safe and secure transport of the person and transfer custody to a responsible person. So again, a memorandum of understanding is a single set of protocols for safe and secure transportation and it's transfer custody to a responsible person. Now we move to criminal gangs. One of the most dangerous population groups that you may encounter is a criminal gang. The Florida statutes define a criminal gang as follows. Criminal gang means a formal or informal ongoing organization, association, or group that has as one of its primary activities the commission of criminal or delinquent acts, and that consists of 3 or more persons who have a common name, common identifying signs, colors, or symbols, including but not limited to terrorist organizations and hate groups. So again, with a criminal gang, you need 3 or more people, and their primary activities are committing criminal acts. Criminal gang activity is any act committed with the intent to benefit or further the interest of a criminal gang. And Florida gangs are overwhelmingly comprised of young males between the ages of 13 and 23. So again, 13 and 23, they're 10 years apart. Good way to memorize that is when you become a teenager, you join a gang, and then that range is 10 years, so 13 to 23. Individuals join gangs for a variety of reasons, including psychological needs, a sense of structure and discipline, a sense of security and protection, social acceptance, self-esteem, and fame. Now we have extremist groups. There are certain organized groups, often known as extremist groups, which advocate violence and the illegal disruption of the lawful activities of others. Terrorism. White supremacist groups are a common terrorism group within the United States. These groups share the ideology that the thoughts, beliefs, and actions of white people are superior to those of other races. Then we have sovereign citizens. The sovereign citizen movement is a subculture of society that holds anti-governmental beliefs and does not recognize federal, state, or local laws, regulations, or policies. They sometimes refer to themselves as constitutionalists or freemen, which indicates their decision to not recognize federal, state, or local laws, regulation, or policies. Many sovereign citizens attempt to establish their beliefs by filing legal documents to renounce their citizenships, return Social Security cards, and cancel birth certificates. They believe in the redemption theory, and this holds that the U.S. government went bankrupt a long time ago when they switched from gold to paper. And this theory also contends that the U.S. government began using citizens as collateral in trade agreements. They believe in emancipating themselves from the U.S. government by refusing to pay taxes, having a license, or obeying laws. And they may engage in criminal activities related to defrauding banks, credit institutions, and the U.S. government because they consider these organizations to be without merit. Make sure to be on guard for drivers who may try and distract you with confusing documents and animated arguments for sovereign status. It may be an ambush. They show you some pictures here of license plate. You have the Republic, Indigenous National, Continental America. They might try to come up with their own private license plates, spelling their personal names in all capital letters, or signing under distress, excessive reference to the Bible, the Constitution, Supreme Court decisions, or treaties with foreign governments. And then we have militias. Militias refuse to recognize the authority of municipal, state, and federal governments. So don't confuse militias with sovereign citizens, because sovereign citizens says here that they're a subculture of society that holds anti-governmental beliefs, and they do not recognize federal, state, or local laws, regulations, or policies, where a militia refused to recognize the authority of city, state, and federal governments. And they're connected by common beliefs. Common beliefs such as the Second Amendment being the cornerstone of the Constitution, that only well-armed people can enforce their own rights, any form of gun regulation is denial of their rights, and the 16th Amendment allowing federal income tax was authorized through fraud. Therefore, militia members train for... Well, let me start over. Militias view law enforcement officers as representatives of the government, which they feel is controlled by people who cannot be trusted to preserve law and order. Therefore, militia members train for preemptive attacks or ambushes by the government and are often arrested for weapons violations. And that concludes Chapter 6.